Hello everybody, I'm Nick, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can use Microsoft's elegant API versioning NuGet package to add amazing API versioning of all sorts of types for your ASP.NET Core API. I'm going to cover most of the features, not all of them, because it is quite a big package, but pretty much every major use case that you might have should be covered in this video. So without any further ado, let's go straight into the code. So what I have here is a simple API controller, and it only has one endpoint, the get product endpoint, which all it does is it gets a GUID from the route here, from the get HTTP get attribute, and then it's faking that it's getting a product just to keep the scope of the video narrow, and just returns it as okay, like it found it. And this is a very common scenario in like REST APIs or CRUD APIs or any sort of APIs. And if I go to Postman, in fact, if I run this first and I go to Postman and I fire a request to that, you will see now that it's returning it. Great. Now, let's say we're 3 years into the future or 2 years in the future, and we need to make a breaking change on our API, but we don't want to break any of our existing customers using that API. What we want to do instead is put a note out that this API will be potentially obsolete or deprecated in the future, or not even do that for now, just parallelly support both API versions and then create a new major release, let's say. How would we do that? Well, that's a very interesting question, and you can do that in multiple levels. There's not one way to do this. But one very simple way to do this is by first going into NuGet and searching for the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core .mvc.versioning. So it's this package over here, and all I need to do is add it into my project and close that NuGet package window. And that package basically has everything we need. To start it off very simply, the first thing you need to do is go into your startup.cs and update the configure services method to include the services.addAPI versioning call. Just by doing that, you now have some sort of versioning. However, you haven't really told .NET Core or ASP.NET Core how you're versioning your API and what you're doing exactly. Which means that if you just run this without doing anything and you try to call an endpoint, the exact same endpoint that was working before, you now get an error which says that, hey, an API version is required but not specified. That is because we haven't configured our API versioning to default to a specific version. For us, the first version presumably is V1 or V1.0. The default way that this works in .NET Core is to have the API-version query string parameter and say equals to 1.0, for example. And that will default and work because, well, it doesn't really default. We just specify, hey, API version is 1, use the first one. And this will work fine. However, this is not ideal because if you make that after the fact mandatory, then your consumers will break. What you want to do instead is you want to enable your API versioning to default to the first version. How you can do that? Well, it turns out that this parenthesis actually accepts an options object. Let me just stop running this project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the parentheses, and then this options object has a ton of properties we can change. The first one would be the assume default version when unspecified, and all you want to say here is true. So we want it to assume the default version. So if I was to run this again and now not have the API versioning here, it is running, and send the request. As you can see now, it is returning without me having to say V1, and that's because it will default to the default when unspecified. But what if you want to have a different version for the default instead of just V1.0? Well, you can say options dot default API version, and here you can tell the system that your default API version is 1.1 if you had such a version. which will translate to, those are major and minor units. So this will translate to 1.1. In our case, usually the first one you're going to version is 1.0. And in that scenario, you don't even need to specify 1.0 here, because API version has a default, which is 1.0. So now, not only we default to a version when unspecified, but we also specify what that default is. So great. We have that covered, but now we need to add the extra endpoint. And there's many ways you can do this. There's no one right or wrong way. Some people, like I've shown in my previous videos, will go under controllers and make a V1 and V2 subcontroller folders, and then they will put the V1 controllers to the V1 folder and the V2 controllers in the V2 folder. We could very much do that, and it's a fine practice. The only reason why I'm not going to do this is, again, because I'm keeping the scope of the video narrow, but it's a great way to organize your controllers if you want to do that. In my scenario, I'm going to showcase how you add a V2 of a specific action in the controller, because that might sometimes happen. You know, the V2 API doesn't have to change everything about the V2 API, but if you break at least one, then it is a major API change. And one of the ways you can do that is copy the same thing, paste it here, and you can say get product V1 and get product V2. That being said, since the object changes itself, you can do the same thing either with the namespace or the object's name and have a V1 and a V2, which means that we can rename this to V1 now. And again, this is completely up to you. Some people do it on the class, some people do it on the namespace with a folder. You can do it the way you like it. And what I'm going to do now in that V1 class is I'm going to create the V2 class, and the breaking change for that response will be the name property. We're going to name it product name now. It's a pretty stupid breaking change if you want my opinion, but it illustrates the point. And now we have our breaking change. Obviously, if I just hit that endpoint, I'm gonna get an error saying, hey, I don't know where I should match this request because nothing tells me where it should go. They look identical. So how do we differentiate them? Well, first, what you can do is you can use the API version attribute. And in the API version, you can say this supports 1.0 and also supports 2.0, but only one of them is the 2.0. So for that scenario, you can say, actually, let me not do it with comma, let me do the extended version, which is you can use the map to API version attribute, and you can specify the version here, which is 2.0. And now, when I run this, and I go back here, when I don't use anything in the query string parameter or the header or anything, and I run this, works fine. I'm getting the old contract. You see it's product name. But if I add comma API version equals 2.0, that's not equals, that's equals, then I'm getting the new version. And of course, you could do this in separate controllers, and in fact, it might be the recommended approach to do it. But again, for now, we're keeping it in the same controller, just to show you how that also plays out, because you might just want to map one of the actions to the new version. So that's one of the ways, but you might be thinking, hey, what if I don't want to have it as a query string parameter? That's weird. Good question, viewer. What you need to do is, of course, remove that from here, and we can go to the startup.cs. And again, this is our magic space of API versioning. You can just say options dot, and you can use an API version reader. And this is effectively a mechanism to tell the request, this is where I'm going to get my version from. The default is a query string parameter, but you might want to change that. One very common practice, for example, is having it in the accept header, or having it in the accept version header, or the content type. There's so many. If you want to have it in the accept header, all you need to do is say new media type API version reader. And here you specify the parameter name, which is, for me, version, if I could type it. here you go. So now if I run this again and go back to Postman and put back that API version in the query string parameter and I run it, it doesn't do anything. It ignores it because I just overrode the query string default handling. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go to the headers, and because Rider already used an accept, I'm going to copy that and paste it here. And then I think by default application JSON is there when you're dealing with JSON requests. So what you would have in that scenario is a semicolon and then version equals to 2.0. And if I do that, now you can see that I get the right contract because it's using that from the header. You might be asking, however, what if I want to have my own API version header? You might want to have something called X version, for example, which is totally fine. It's completely up to you. You're not having to conform to any standard. If you want to do that, you can do it. So for that, you can use the new header API version reader, and you can paste that here. And if you do that and I run my code again, then let me just copy that, and you can simply obviously remove it from here. We don't need it anymore. You have X version as the header, and then the value is 2.0. And if I press send, as you can see, still in 2.0. If I remove it or I make it 1.0, again, back to the first one. So that's how you can be flexible with where you want it. But it doesn't stop it there. In some scenarios, you might want to support multiple ways of your application handling the version, because even the version handling way might be legacy and you want to effectively deprecate in the future. How can you do this? Well, what you can do, and let's actually use the previous examples that I just used. If I just stop this, what we have is the media type. Let me just put it in a new line. And we also have the header type. You can use the API version reader class, and it has a combine method. And this will combine multiple methods into one, which allows you to use both of them effectively in your versioning to pick up your version. So for example, you can have the X version here, and you can also have the I think I did a mistake here. I'll fix it in a second. So you have the X version and you have the simple version from the accept header. And if I remove that and I run my code and go back to the Postman, then X version here, V1, X version here, V2, or version equals 2.0, if I disable that, still works. I don't think I've tried to see exactly what happens when you have both and they're wrong. Okay, it is being handled. The application will understand that you're requesting both of them and it will throw. So that's good. I didn't actually test this before the video, but this is how you can have multiple ones as well. Now, if I go to the headers, you will see, if I run this request again, you will see that nothing reports back what API versions are supported. And this is usually good to know when somebody's integrating with you, because they might want to try the new one, they might want to see if there's a minor version that they can upgrade to, and so on and so forth. The way you can do this is, again, from the magical method API versioning, you can do options dot, and you can use the report API versions equals true. And if you do that, then you can debug your code, run the exact same request, and you'll see in the response headers that we now have an API supported versions with 1.0 and 2.0 as versions that the API supports, which is great because now we know exactly what's up. The extra thing is, what if V1 is actually deprecated and we want to kill it in the future, and we communicated that to the customers and we want to also let the developers know through header or whoever's integrating with the API? all you need to do is set the deprecated property in the API version to true. And as long as you do that, there will be a new header, assuming I did this correctly. As you can see now, API deprecated versions 1.0, API supported versions 2.0. So we're reporting back in headers. That's a good practice, so your consumers know what version they should be on. Potentially they're gonna Google, hey, what about this deprecation? What's the date? I need to start moving forward. When is this end of life? So it's good to communicate it back. A final thing that you might wanna have or support is URL based versioning, /API / it's how I used to do it in my REST API video. So I would have a v1 here, and then the v2 would have a v2 there. And this is also a very good way to version your application. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's just another way to do it. The way you can configure it here is as follows. First, I'm gonna comment out this API version reader because we just want to use the route one. So what I need to do here is say /v and then angle brackets, whatever they're called, and then version and then colon 2 dots API version. And if I do that, now I can run my application. And if I go to Postman again, this will now be ignored. In fact, I should get a 404 when I click send. And indeed I do, because this URL doesn't exist anymore. The URL is /v and the version. Now the version comes in two ways. You can either have the full major and minor version, and you can just say 2.0 and you get the right version, or 1.0 and you get the right version. Or you can just say, if you want to only deal with major, so if you don't have 1.1 or 1.2, you just care about major, it will understand v1 and also v2. So it uses the major unit if there is no dot there. Very, very flexible, very, very smart. And I really, really like that. And it actually doesn't stop there, because, in fact, let me just remove that. Because what if you don't want to decorate your controller with all of these API version attributes? In my opinion, by the way, I would leave them there because it makes it visible when you're looking at the controller. But there's also a different way, if that's more of your cup of tea, where you can go to the startup. So let me just remove that. And now I removed all the versioning. And if I go to the startup and I enable back this API versioning strategy, I didn't want to do this. That's what I want to do. You can use options dot conventions, and then you can have controller, and you can get controller by type. In my scenario, it's the product controller. So you have this Fluent API, and you can just say at the controller level has API version. I'm going to use the extension method on this, which allows me to go forward. Yes, this one. And you simply say 1, 0, and this version allows me to chain multiple ones. So I can say also has API version 2, 0, and if 1.0 is deprecated, why don't you like this? Oh, because I said versions. This needs to be version. If 1 is deprecated, you can say has deprecated version 1.0 and has API versions 2.0. And on top of that, you can say on a specific action level, and this is a bit dirtier, so I don't really recommend it, but I'm going to show you how you can do it anyway. You can say type of products controller dot get method, and then you can do name of controller dot v2 get product v2. I'm going to put an exclamation mark here to tell it that it's definitely not null. I really don't recommend this. I'm going to show you what it does and how it works anyway, because you might want to use it. Map to API version, and then we will map it to major and minor, which is 0, which is 2 and 0. So with this, I basically recreated what I had in the controller level here and here with attributes on startup. And if I run this, assuming I did this correctly, which I think I did, and I fire off this request. Not found, yes, because we removed the attribute, the route, so that was a close one. Product name, it's being picked up by the version here, and if I do 1.0, works fine. Obviously, doing a get method on the type, I mean, I'm sure this is optimized in memory when the application runs and every subsequent request is fast. I probably would do it with attributes. I think it also makes it more visible to see what's going on in that controller. But I can also see how if you have all of this in a single extension and you register it at once and you have it grouped, it can also be very useful for you. And with that, I covered every major feature of this package. Of course, there's many more, but knowing what you learned through this video, you should be able to do anything API versioning wise with that package. On top of that, you can register middleware, have more error responses, or customize them. You can do all sorts of stuff, but that's the basics. And with that video, I believe that you can dive straight into that and make the versioning that you like. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching. Special thanks to my Patreons for making these videos possible. If you want to support me as well, you're going to find a link in the description down below. Leave a like if you like this video, subscribe for more content like this, and ring the bell as well. And I'll see you in the next video. Keep coding.